Hi, Angela here, and I'm sharing today joy is a choice with the topic of also um, how do we choose it? How do we actually understand what that choice is? So, joy is a choice. You may have heard of the old story about the two wolves. Which one are you going to feed? The one that has what you don't want in life, or you're going to feed the wolf that brings you what you do want in life? Sorry, I'm really not doing a great job on explaining that old myth. But it's always about, joy is about understanding what role it plays in your life. Joy is something that is natural to a lot of children. It is natural to a lot of people. And somewhere in our lives, joy seems to be shunted and put away somewhere as if it's optional. It's not necessary, and it's also conditional, very conditional. It's that you can be joyful in this circumstance or in that circumstance. So what that starts to engender in all of us, because our world perhaps is saying that joy is only appropriate in certain places, is that we individually start to say, well, I don't have to be joyful here, or I choose not to be joyful, or perhaps that joy is not necessarily something I can choose in this moment. We also, because we've been conditioned to not relate to joy just naturally, spontaneously, it's conditioned out of us in a lot of ways, we also start to think that joy should be only appropriate in certain circumstances, and we can judge others as well if they're joyful and we're not. So joy is something that if you are conditioned out of it, it can be actually really pushed into a box somewhere hidden in your life. You know, like if you've got jewellery that you only take out for special occasions, and then sometimes you might forget where you've put the jewellery as well, and you just leave it there and you never wear it. So joy becomes very squashed in a lot of our lives. And in our bodies, what happens is we become very frightened, conditional, edgy about expressing joy naturally and freely. So when I'm saying joy is a choice, I am not saying to ignore suffering. I'm saying to understand that if joy has been squashed out of our lives in general, as humanity, as a modern civilization, and we can see it in children and not celebrate joy as adults, there can be a sort of meeting point as an adult to sort of say, well, in this moment, how can I choose to be joyful without ignoring suffering? And it's also about, as an adult, if we understand that joy is being shunted into some hidden part of our lives, to actually say, well, I'm choosing here to bring something in that's joyful in this situation. Of course, not ignoring suffering, but how to actually understand what role you play in that moment. And that can be a joyful experience. So if it's listening to a friend who's suffering, it can be really joyful to be there for them because you're just listening. You're not telling them what to do. You don't have to do anything. It can be joyful because for that moment when you're listening to your friend who's suffering, you can actually stop having to be conditioned. You can become human in that moment. That's a wonderful, joyful experience. If you've ever had kids and you've watched them stumble or fall, they're going to scream, they're going to cry. And if you're there as a parent to just go, oh, and then you're with that child, they'll stop crying eventually, unless there's a serious wound or something. But that's a very key signature about humans and how we operate. We are able to experience suffering, but with being present with someone, like an adult with a kid, if they've fallen over, that suffering can pass. What also gets conditioned into us globally as a species now, it has been for a long time, but it's perhaps more obvious to us now, is suffering. I'm going to do another video on that, about suffering, how it becomes expected. We think that suffering is something we have to experience and hold on to, and we don't know how to let go. And again, I'll use the child analogy. If you've got kids, if they fall over and they cry and they're not attended to, And I don't mean that you have to be an overprotective parent, but I'm just saying if it's not acknowledged, they can get into habits where they think crying is a normal response to suffering. They can learn to get stuck in emotions, or they can learn that by being stuck in emotions, they get certain reactions from the people around them, both what they want and what they don't want. So they will learn, if they're not given alternatives to crying or how to get out of crying, that they may just keep going into negative emotions because that's what becomes comfortable for them. So suffering for a lot of us has become comfortable and kind of addictive. Thanks to all of you who are joining. Hi, Pauline and Madhusudan. Madhusudan will have to try and teach me how to say your name. And hi, Sylvia. And if we're going to look at a new way of understanding joy, this is what I wanted to finish with. Do we understand joy and our responsibility or choice in creating the love that we want in our lives? If you've grown up in a culture, a civilization, a period of time where joy is kind of like shunted and it's not cool to express joy naturally and freely, what happens is you get conditioned responses in your body that suppress joy, and you're fearful of other people's judgment of you if you express it, more so when you're an adult or a teenager. So what you're doing when you actually decide as a teenager or adult to start to choose a different response, to start to express joy in a way that's perhaps just natural and spontaneous, not forcing it, you're actually saying, this is the kind of energy I want to bring into this room, this conversation, this space right now. And you're also saying that even if I grew up in a culture that's conditioned about what's cool and what's not cool to express about joy, you're saying, I'm just going to experience what I want to experience. You're not being a rebel. You're not sort of protesting. You're just saying, I'm being natural. I'm being authentic. And you're doing a very big job in breaking down the inauthenticity that can be in our culture when we condition joy and say it should be this way, you can't do that, you can't dance in the street, you can't be laughing too loud. When you're just naturally joyful without forcing it and saying, well, I'm going to create a different response here, instead of maybe seeing someone's negative experience and feeling pulled down by it, you're actually very powerful by focusing on joy. And joy doesn't have to be effusive. It doesn't have to be dancing in the street, even though I like to do that once in a while. Joy can be a natural thing, such as if someone's having a bad moment on the bus, and our natural response if we're in a public space with someone having a bad moment is to all shrink inside and hide. But if you can just sort of go, wow, I wonder what's going on for that person internally, not verbally, but just thinking a good thought to them, that's a moment of joy. That's a moment of sharing, hey, I just want something better for that person if they're having a hard time, rather than just criticize them and go, oh, please don't interrupt my transit home. I've had a really stressful day. It's really just staying open to what's around you. And that is where joy and natural feelings of being connected to others can start to flow in our lives. So if you have interest in experiencing joy, it is about focusing on it and doing focused activity. I have done a lot of spontaneous activities in my life, but what I've learnt from doing things spontaneously is that if I don't do that, joy doesn't happen in my life. If I don't go into the supermarket and start dancing to some music spontaneously, I don't experience joy. If I don't allow myself to have a good laugh every couple of minutes, pretty much these days, joy doesn't come. So I'm not saying to force yourself to practice it, but if you have difficulty inviting joy, I actually do recommend you focus on it. Watch a funny video. Remember a funny moment with a friend. Review those in your life, because what happens is joy is infectious, just like watching a kid laugh. It is incredibly wonderful. And what you start to do when you focus on it is you invite it in, and you actually switch the pattern of focusing on suffering to a lesser degree. It's not about ignoring suffering, but if you don't focus on joy, it can't blossom. And then you might have to look at some of those habits you have that stop joy from being allowed to become truly fully celebrated by your whole body, because we all do that. We'll let a little bit of joy come in and then we'll shut it down. What I've learned from infectious joy, from remembering moments that make you spontaneously bubble up inside, is that your focus starts to go to that naturally, just like children like funny things on clowns, or if you don't like clowns, whatever makes you like the Wiggles or something like that. You're naturally going to gravitate towards that. As adults, we tend to think because we've had experiences that we should focus on suffering. That's not really what we need to do. We need to actually look at joy. And so finally, if you do know anyone in Sydney, Australia, I want to share a very special movement meditation in nature. We're doing part of it in nature in May 6 and May 20, and I have the links in the description there, which is actually about aligning with joy in your body, in your energy body, in your heart, of course, and anchoring that in your space, in your field. We do need to practice that in our body, because some of us have habits in our body over the conditioning of our lives that will shut down when joy starts to flower naturally. And so I wish to share that May 6 and May 20 in Sydney, Australia. I've got the links there in the description. And if you know anyone in Sydney who's ready to align with joy, please send them my way, because I love to have a good laugh. I love to enjoy people, and I love to share that joy that can be part of your life as a continual bubbling energy of really joy that grows and grows and sustains in our lives. So that's my sharing for today. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, Patty. Hi, Lisa. And anything that you would like to add in the comments about joy, about focusing on joy, about not focusing on suffering or addressing suffering, please put that in, because I am going to do another video on suffering to see how we can move through suffering and find the joy that we're all really, really looking for. Thanks, everyone.